It is now the time.
Here we go. Now we're live. Welcome to my second ever live video show. The topic today is vulnerability hangovers, and I'm co-hosted with my dear friend Margarita Tizato, who is well-trained in trauma-sensitive yoga. She has taught yoga in prisons and in rehabs and all over the damn place. And I wanted her to bring a trauma-informed perspective to this topic.
Thank you, Lila.
So I thought we'd begin by talking about what a vulnerability hangover is, right? So we'll define this to see how we can discuss it. No, that's not how I'm going to start.
Yay! Rebellion!
I'm going to tell you a little story. So the other night here, on Sunday night, I went to a cacao ceremony, and that tends to be something that I don't go to in New York, and I had the sense that it was like too woo-woo for me, and I wasn't really going to enjoy it very much. And instead what I found was a really beautiful gathering that reminded me some of my intimacy workshops, where we just did a lot of singing together and intention setting and group sharing of limiting beliefs, and with an intention to release them, an intention to co-create an energy that helps us to self-actualize. And I found it really, really beautiful. And in the middle of it, there was an opportunity for us to share something, for us to maybe just share what was happening inside us, or maybe share a song. And I decided that I wanted to lead people in a chant, because I hadn't done that in a while, and I missed it. It's one of the things that I love to do the most. And I did, and I like put myself forward and started to lead this chant, and only about half of the people participated. And because they were playing guitars and drums, and so it was really rousing when they were playing, but I was just doing this a cappella. Only half of the people participating in this circle felt a little thin, let's say. And I also felt like, okay. I had the story that people were judging me for trying to lead in an environment in which I hadn't like earned some sort of credibility. And then right after that, a guy who was a part of the musician panel shared the Lady Gaga song "Shallow," and I had just learned that song before I came here, actually. So he invited everybody to sing along if they knew it, and he was going to sing the duet with his wife. But when the time came for the Lady Gaga part, she forgot it or blanked or had a moment of, stage fright or something, where she wasn't singing it, and I knew it. So I was like, oh, I've overstepped. I'm singing her part really loud, and so I quieted myself. And then he was like, no, go ahead, because I knew the part. And so we sang that together, and then I got a little like polite smattering of applause after my, and he got this like rousing, screaming, delightful thing. But I was a part of that. Still, afterwards, I felt super exposed and like I'd overstepped. Like people didn't like me, like people were judging me, and I had all that stuff bubble up. I felt a little anxious, felt a little like I wanted to hide. And I was thinking about how I was being perceived. I was self-conscious and aware of how I was being perceived by the others. And I participated in the rest of the ceremony. And then at the end, we were supposed to do a shavasana, or a resting pose. And I just did the fetal position. I just like curled up in the fetal position because I needed to soothe myself after having all of those feelings come up, regardless of whether that's what people were experiencing or thinking. I wanted to be seen by them as, somebody who was lovely, somebody who had a beautiful voice, somebody who was powerful and participating. And in that space before I had any chance to receive any responses, my internal experience was fear. You know, how am I going to be perceived? I've had vulnerability hangovers also after sharing other kinds of art, like my second year project at ETW, the experimental theater wing where I went to school. By the way, ETW is dubbed the Naked Studio because so many people get naked in their projects because it's experimental. They're very free, and we're very free with our expression when we do work there. And I vowed that I was not going to get naked in my second year project, but then I totally got naked and covered in gold paint. It was just an opportunity, you know. And I was the mud flap girl. If you've seen the mud flap girl on the, you know, on the stickers, right, on the cars. And the whole thing was, you know, my body is not pornographic. You know, I can share it in the way that I want. I don't have to fit into your mold. If I do, it's for my pleasure. You know. And after that, my dad was there, by the way, and I definitely had a bit of a vulnerability hangover after that, especially having vowed that I wasn't going to get naked in my project, and I did. And then another one that I remembered as I was thinking about this topic was I shared this story, and some of you know this story, about a guy that I kind of held this candle for about 5 years who just really wasn't that interested in me. Nicholas, and how we had this, you know, one weekend away. And then, I mean, I first met him when I was in my early 20s, and I had sex with him without a condom, which I think was the first time I'd ever done that, because I thought if I did that, he would fall in love with me. Like, I thought that's how it worked, you know?
Automatic.
That is how it works. It's not how it works.
I get it.
Oh my God.
So I told that whole story, and it was the first time I'd been sharing only a little bit of my personal stories each week in my email missive, enough to speak to the topic, enough that, you know, it's the amount that I would use at the beginning of a yoga class, enough to be relevant, enough to be connected, not so much that it's like a one-woman show. But this was like a one-woman show, right? I shared this post, and I was like, hey, warning, my friends who are unused to this, this one is extremely personal and extremely vulnerable. And I, you know, pressed send on that, and I was like, you know, what's going to happen? What happened after that was each of my emails usually got about 3 responses, and that one got 25. So many people, it resonated with so many people. And I think that was the beginnings of Horizontal, the beginnings of sharing things that really feel ticklish to share, that if I feel like a little trepidatious to click send or click publish or click upload, then I know I have something that will probably relate to other people quite well. So now let's talk about what a vulnerability hangover is. I began by writing my own definition and then looking to see what Brené Brown had to say about it, since she coined the term. So my first stab at a definition was thorny sensations and emotions that arise after one has made oneself vulnerable, a feeling of overexposure. And Brené Brown in her TED Talk, The Power of Vulnerability. So I thought I had made this term up. Turns out it was Brené Brown.
I didn't know it was Brené Brown.
She calls it a gut-wrenching feeling that happens the moment we decide to get real about who we are, what we want, and how we express it. Although I think the hangover doesn't usually happen right away, right? It doesn't usually happen at the moment of thought that you're going to do it. It usually happens when you've done it. And then it can happen very quickly, a split second after you've done it. You're like, oh, regret, you know. But, but usually I don't think it is at that level of thought. And then I thought, well, there's a high to sharing like that. There's an adrenaline rush. So then I started to conceptualize it as the crash after the adrenaline rush of taking a risk. When I was a teenager, I had a friend named Marley who I met at summer camp, Smart Kid Camp, when I was 12 years old. And she and I used to be pen pals. She was a very private person in general, but she shared a lot with me. And I remember her saying, we were probably 15 or 16, that she didn't just share her special self with anyone. Right? And as I kind of wound back, yeah, it is Dino. As I kind of wound back peeled back the onion layers of that, I started to see, if I show my special self to anyone and they don't appreciate it or they reject me, then I'm really rejected. Then they're really rejecting me because they've seen my special self. But if I don't show my special self and they reject me, well, it wasn't really me. The me on the inside of the walnut shell is still protected. So now I'm thinking of it and combining definitions, thinking of it as the gut-wrenching feelings that arise after you expose your special self to someone or someone's. And it's that sense like, oh, I feel so exposed.
Yeah.
So exposure and the risk of rejection are the dual premises, I think, that characterize this vulnerability hangover. Marguerite, I was wondering if you had a trauma-informed perspective on what a vulnerability hangover is.
It's essentially the same thing. I do like the definition. I think that what might be unique to the trauma informed perspective is that sometimes people that have experienced trauma or they're dealing with PTSD to whatever level have moments of dissociative oversharing. So that one of the things that can happen that's actually quite common is that there might be a sensation of perceived safety that can bring that on, or there could be a trigger that can bring that on, or a number of other factors, but such that things might start to come out in a way that is not necessarily thought of or chosen or
maybe not appropriate to the context.
Not appropriate to the context, right? And so it does happen. It's one of the things that even in like yoga classes that we are often warned about is that people might come sharing their stories, and sometimes they want to, and people want to be listened to, and that's great. And sometimes they don't, and sometimes people will never come back because they have much longer and much worse vulnerability hangovers than other people because they possibly have overshared or feel like they have overshared or shared stuff that like they were not ready to bring up or that didn't make them feel safe.
That's such an important point that I didn't even think of as I was preparing for this, that the length depends on the person and the kind of sharing, the amount of sharing, and the context in which it's shared.
Yeah.
So we think of a hangover, like a hangover is not going to last more than a day, but a vulnerability hangover could last a long, long time.
Yeah, it could. I mean, people that have complex trauma tend to, you can think of them as being in that state constantly, like
a constant state of vulnerability hangover. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah, if you consider, for example, people that have had very unsafe childhoods,
yeah,
right? Because they were neglected or because they were abused or whatever. So for extended periods of time, at a time possibly when they were not capable of taking care of themselves or defending themselves, and possibly things coming from people that were supposed to be their caregivers, right? Parents or caregivers, showing their special self was not a safe thing to do, and it was never an option.
Yeah.
Right. And so possibly every time that they tried to do that, expressing a need or expressing emotions or love or whatever, the result was dramatic and not what should have been. And so for their entire lives afterwards, sometimes people get treatment, have access to stuff and resources and get better. A lot of people, and some people don't, and to the point where sharing things that are personal, sharing their special self is just never becomes a safe thing to do.
It's not safe, yeah. Let's back up a little bit and think about vulnerability briefly. What is it? Why would we risk it at all?
Right.
Right? Right?
Here's the question. Yeah.
Look at everybody shifting in their chairs.
And we're like,
Our bodies are talking.
shifting in their chairs. We're all like, why?
I don't have any feelings about this. I don't know.
I'm fine. I totally don't have any feelings.
I'm fine.
Okay, take its time.
Yeah, just to let everyone know. Yeah, totally fine.
From Brene Brown's talk, TED Talk, The Power of Vulnerability, there are a few key points that I wanted to pull out. Shame can be traced to a fear of disconnection. Disconnection makes us miserable. The people who feel love and belonging, she calls them the wholehearted, are the ones who feel that they are worthy of it. And that sense of worthiness gives them the courage to, quote, tell the story of who they are with their whole hearts. Because the origin of courage actually comes from C-O-R, core, which means heart.
Yeah.
In order to tell the story of who you are with your whole heart, you're going to have to be vulnerable. Vulnerability is the magic ingredient of connection. And then I added, I can't remember if this is part of that talk, vulnerability is a skill. And we could think of it as also an act of will. One of the best things I ever heard about restorative yoga was Jillian Pransky in my teacher training said, surrender is an act of will. It's not just like you lie there and you're like, oh yeah.
It's a choice.
It's like you have to work on it. And you have to practice it. And it's something that we can become more skillful at should we choose to practice it. We don't have to. We can continue to live with the armors that keep us feeling status quo and safe. And that is a choice. But if we choose to work with vulnerability, we can practice it as a skill, and we can open more. We can improve at the skill of vulnerability. So how do we know? I made a little list of ways you might be able to tell you're experiencing your own vulnerability.
Dot.
You feel exposed, as I mentioned before. You feel as though you're not wearing your usual armor. You feel uncomposed or less composed than usual. You might feel like your actual skin is thinner than usual, or maybe like you don't have any skin at all. You haven't told anyone that thing before. This is the first time you're sharing something. You're attempting something new. You're trying something that you haven't done, or you're practicing something that you're not good at yet.
Yeah.
You're telling people what you really think instead of trying to please them or make them feel okay, which is the codependent strategy that I have used for many of my years. And concurrently, you're following your own desires instead of trying to people please. Lady even talked about this on my podcast. Like, is it okay for me to want this much time for my sexual encounter? Is it okay for me to be served and to be pleasured for this long? that's really my desire. Can I express it? Is it okay?
Is it okay?
Okay. You're making, this is the special self bit. You feel like you're making your insides visible to your outsides.
Yeah.
You're grieving over anything. We can grieve over all kinds of things. The beginning of something that we want very much can be grief mixed with grief over something that we didn't even like that much, you know? And you feel anxious. I usually feel it in my solar plexus, a pain, pressure in my solar plexus. You're feeling anxious about getting flat or fearful about repercussions, what's going to happen after you've been vulnerable. Can you think of any other signs that you might be able to tell you're experiencing your own vulnerability and if anybody else in the chat wants to chime in, you can do so in the chat on the left, and you can also cam up if you want.
Yeah. I think, wait, chat. I think there might be an exhaustion piece that for me, I feel like feeling exhausted from opening up.
Ooh.
You know, that you're like tired, because when you have a hangover, you're tired, you've been drinking, you're depleted.
Yes.
It almost feels like, to me, I feel that exhaustion. Like I've been talking about this and talking and feeling it and going back to that place in order to be authentic. And now I just feel exhausted. I'm glad I did it, but I am physically, and you mentioned this closing up. It's a wave, right? Like if we open up, if you extend, then you also have to come in. So it feels balanced. You know, you can't be in extension all the time. That causes pain, or in contraction all the time. So to me, shows up as exhaustion, and the hangover is needed to go rest up all that courage that it took to open up.
Yeah.
You know?
Did you wind up feeling that way after we recorded for 5 hours?
100%. And it's showing up with my coaching. You know, every time I do a workshop, I'm trying to show up as authentic, and people ask, well, what made you be a coach or this? And there's major events in my life that has led here. And it's funny, sometimes I could tell them and I'm okay. And sometimes it's like a fucking storm that comes through, and then everyone is okay. I felt good being open, but then I have to go nurse that. And it's so exhausting. And especially now as a coach, I haven't found the balance, because you're always talking about it and to new audiences and repeating, and someone interviews you and the same questions. And I'm so exhausted from being vulnerable.
Yeah.
Like, I know it's good, but I'm like,
totally.
I need a fucking break.
Yeah.
Totally. So
like,
maybe
pardon me. It's like, I'm sorry. I'm a little tired of being vulnerable. Can we do this later? I'm getting teary-eyed.
List that one sign that you've been vulnerable is that you might feel depleted.
Yeah. Like after a trip, right? You go up, and then that day after that mushroom trip, there's nothing wrong. You just need to rest it off.
Yeah.
Or any other trip.
I think we agree intellectually that it is, important to do, and that it's powerful, and it's generally positive for most of us to practice vulnerability. And I was thinking also, in order to learn a new language, right? So I spoke, my mom says when I was 3 years old, I spoke 300 words in English and 300 words in Portuguese. And then I stopped wanting to speak. They took me back to the States. I refused to speak. And so I didn't really learn again until after college, when I went to spend 3 months and lived with my late aunt and really immersed myself. She didn't speak much English. I took classes. I hung out with a capoeira group. They didn't speak English. So I really had to learn, just for my desire to communicate and be in contact with people. But in order to do that, you have to be willing to make a fool of yourself, because you're going to make mistakes and people are going to laugh. because
Yeah.
it's hilarious, and it reminded me of a story that my dad told me about my mom. So my mom, when she came to the States as a Brazilian immigrant to marry my father, also didn't speak much English. They met and they didn't have many words to share with each other because he didn't speak much Portuguese and she didn't speak much English. And so she, in the process of learning English, I think they were having a dinner party, and she said, Tony, I need a fuck. And my mother was like, what? Because she was trying to say the word fork, but could not recall the word fork. So she was like, oh, fuck. I need a fuck.
I need to now.
So unlike your mom, it's like it makes it even funnier. It's like, and your dad was like, well.
But I think it's cute. In languages, I use it as cuteness. I know that me fucking up sounds cute in another language.
You know that.
Yeah.
But a lot of people open their mouths.
Yeah, it's like just
plenty of people are too scared to open their mouths until they have it correctly, until they have it perfect. So instead they're going on their phones and having the phone translate for them, which is not the way that you learn.
Yeah.
Not the way that you learn. She probably never forgot the word fork ever again.
Or fuck.
Or fuck.
Those are equally necessary words, you know?
Because the emotional experience of being a fool, of being laughed at, is impressionable, right? It's indelible. It leaves a mark, and you remember. You then you learn. You remember.
Yeah.
So that's that's one way. I also thought about the ways that, and I am practicing vulnerability a lot, right? I teach these workshops about trust and vulnerability. I share so much of myself on the podcast. This is what you could say it's what I do. Like it's my work. It's my life's work. And yet I wrote down some ways that I resist feeling the fear of disconnection, the fear of rejection. One is I reach for my phone, just like most of us. I really wish I didn't, but I do. And I do it a lot. I do it on the subway. I do it if I am out alone. I do it even when I don't have Wi-Fi here sometimes, just if I want to make a barrier between myself and some perceived risk of vulnerability. If I'm eating out alone, I always have a book.
Why do you think that has to do with vulnerability? And not like boredom or wanting to keep the world out of your face? Or
so sometimes I use it for that.
Yeah.
But I notice that I often, when I feel a discomfort and people are in a group talking to each other, people are not talking to me, I'm in a new environment, and I feel the concern that I'm not going to be accepted or welcomed in, I pick up my phone.
So maybe it's intention.
Bye, Esther. Thanks for joining.
Well,
So
I think it's
sometimes I reach to it to occupy myself, or sometimes I reach to it to keep people away, definitely. But I notice when I do it because I'm concerned that I'm going to be rejected. What were you going to say, Becca?
I was just going to say the thing about like eating out alone, that's like a big one for me personally, of like I have a really hard time like allowing myself to like be seen alone in a public space without feeling like, oh, I have to like either make it look like I'm waiting for someone or that I'm like occupied, because like the thought of being perceived as like someone who is alone, it makes me feel very vulnerable. So as soon as you said that, I was like, yeah, totally. It gives you a place to like get the endorphin boost of whatever our little social media like dopamine hits, and also kind of like helps you shape how you're perceived by others in a way that might make one feel a little bit more in control. And you've mentioned earlier that like like how the feeling that you're being perceived by others is something that makes us feel very vulnerable, or not perceived, but like judged.
Seen.
Yeah.
And it's culturally enforced, right? Every time, almost without exception, I go into a restaurant by myself, the person who seats me says just one.
Right?
Just one. And I've started saying, not just one. And smiling really wide. And almost everybody.
Yeah. What is it about the word just that does that? What is it? Just is so
it's diminishing.
It's so funny. I've always found it incredibly satisfying to go to restaurants by myself.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
Bars, maybe not, but even bars. But restaurants, yeah, I go and I'm like, yeah, it's me, it's just me.
Yeah.
It's so good. Anyway.
It's a rebellion.
I always have a book or a journal. I'm reading or writing. I'm occupying myself in some way. And it reminds me of the meme that has a person sitting alone with their coffee with no tablet, no phone, no journal, no book. And everybody around them looks at them and goes, weirdo.
There's a Sex in the City episode that she sits down and she's like, I think she even takes off the glasses and everything, like, just me here. It's pretty powerful, I think, to be comfortable there.
Yeah.
So that's something that I could practice in order to try and inoculate myself against that discomfort, right? Is just taking 10 minutes to start with. If that's too much, 5, where I just don't occupy myself with something and I just sit there and observe the world and eat alone. Yeah. Another thing I noticed that I do, and I did it the other night at the cacao ceremony, I saw this really hot, buff Viking man covered in tattoos, and I talked to the person next to him.
That's a good one.
What's the intention?
Right? So I turned left.
Hi.
And I connected to the person next to him, hoping that he would notice me. You know, it's just I did actually say hello, but then I turned and focused my attention on somebody else where the risk of rejection wasn't so great. That's something I did recently.
How did it turn out then?
With who? Right after the cacao ceremony, so I couldn't talk to him. I was hoping he would. Part of the reason why I shared that song was probably so he would notice me, but he was gone afterwards.
If he would have done the same to you and spoken to someone next to you, what would have been like the effect on you? If the intention was, let me stab you in the eye. You're not that cute.
Looking like sweaty. Fuck.
Fork.
Thank you, intimacy coach. Another thing on my list was headphones, but it's quite similar to the book or picking up the phone, right? Yeah. If I filter out things, then I don't have to be susceptible to them or vulnerable to them. And then another thing I noticed is that I will avoid eye contact after sharing something vulnerable or performing, or when I sit down, I usually just like lower my eyes and go in, and it's because I don't want people to think that I'm thirsting for their approval, even though I probably want their approval. I don't want them to think that I need it, so I just avoid eye contact and go into myself. Another way might be rejecting someone before they can reject me first? In a subtle way, sometimes body language, turning away. If he had talked to somebody next to me, I guarantee you I would have turned my back to them.
That's sophisticated strategies.
Oh,
Those are fire.
man, keeping me disconnected. And similarly, if I'm craving somebody's approval, and it goes right underneath that category. But if I'm craving their approval, I might step away from them, step back, so that it doesn't feel so risky. And the last one I wrote down was I might switch out of participating and feeling things in my body and into observer mode, judger mode, witness, because I can't be hurt that way. I love to be watching everything on the outside because it makes me less vulnerable, right? That's why I circle a sex party instead of, diving in, right? I'm on the periphery because it doesn't make me as susceptible. If there's anyone who wants to share anything, you can make a mention in the comments on the left, and you can cam up. Just let us know. Hi, Eric. Glad you're here. And do any of you notice ways that you resist feeling this fear of disconnection or rejection? Margarita?
What? I'm so good at vulnerability. What are you talking about? I'm a champ. Actually, I can wait for this if somebody else wants to share ways that we avoid vulnerability, because I actually would like to speak in favor of avoiding vulnerability.
In favor of that?
Yeah. So before I get into that subject, if somebody else wants to
does anybody have anything to add to that list? No? So then
I don't know if this is like kind of reiterating what you've already said, so feel free to be like, we've already said this, but I think like honestly, just like true isolation, like leaving the space, or like then intentionally spending more time alone than normal. Like I think as soon as I start to feel vulnerable, it's like sometimes it's the observer, and sometimes it's like I'm literally going to go step outside and like take some air, or like, okay, this has been fun, I'm not going to go socialize for another week or two because I'm like too exposed and need to like completely hermit up to like punish myself, ? Like I don't really know what that is, but there is definitely, I think my biggest reaction to feeling vulnerable is like intense isolation, which feels kind of counterintuitive because it's like it's opening up is a way of connecting with other people, but it's like it's rejecting others before they can reject you, or just like not even letting yourself be in the space.
Yeah. I will definitely leave an event if I'm not feeling, if I've hit my threshold of willingness to be sensitive.
Yeah. And you might want to be vulnerable on your own too. Like vulnerability is not always all about sharing. Like sometimes I want to cry by myself or be down alone because people want to give you solutions right away, or it's going to be good, or the awkward hug, or they want to, and sometimes even that becomes overwhelming. So sometimes just being like, I'm the one that wants to witness my own vulnerability. Like I'm okay. Like it's not always about an audience, and like being true to yourself and be like, I need a few days to just be home and be messy.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And the lack of audience in a way gives you space to be a different kind of vulnerable. Like when you're alone with your thoughts or with like a journal, like there's a different kind of relationship there than like being like, am I actually being vulnerable, or am I like performing things that are like seemingly vulnerable that are easy to like seem like I'm connecting?
Well, you're also analyzing too, like you're being vulnerable and you're like looking at the reaction, and it may not be like a raw vulnerability of like, okay, nobody's here, I can just be myself. So I think it's not always good. Not everyone can handle vulnerability, and that could be a segue too. against vulnerability, which is what my lover does. Like, not everyone deserves it.
I don't think. Should I go?
Please, yes.
This is the moment where.
Also, if you're vulnerable solo, you can hold yourself.
Yeah. And the way you want to hold it.
For you. Yeah. You know?
Yeah.
So you're going to take care of you in the way that you need. Go ahead, Margarita.
Exactly.
So the one thing that I'm really, really clear about is that vulnerability is a privilege.
Yeah.
The possibility of being vulnerable, which means, as we were just saying, right, the ability and the possibility to show our true self and our special self, and to put ourselves in risky, dangerous, or uncertain position, emotionally speaking, right, is a privilege. And it's a privilege that comes with having experienced safety, right?
Yes.
And it's a privilege that comes with having experienced and having learned how to regulate ourselves. All of these things that we were just saying, right? All the ability of like nurture our vulnerability hangover, right? Yeah. And taking care of ourselves and being vulnerable by ourselves when we want to, right? And a lot of the people that I work with don't have that, and they've never had it, right? And I think that sometimes in our circles, and I'm a yoga teacher, right? In our circles, and by that I mean, you know, yoga, new agey, new tantra, Bali,
connection, relationships,
connections, on and so forth. There is a lot of talk about vulnerability and not enough talk about what are the prerequisites.
Yeah.
Privilege.
How to get in.
Also, how to what are the prerequisites so that people can. I mean, vulnerability is inherently a feeling of lack of safety to some extent, but it's not that lack of like basic safety that makes it so that we can't regulate ourselves and that we drag that hangover for like weeks or months.
Right. And if our attachment style is anxious or avoidant because when we went off to play, mom disappeared, you know, and we didn't have mom to come back to, then that's not going to set us up with that sense of safety that allows us to take these emotional risks later in life.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. So there is also an argument in favor of the fact that there are spaces to be vulnerable, and there are spaces that are maybe just not appropriate. And if they're not appropriate spaces to be vulnerable, reaching for your phone or reading a book or walking the fuck out or doing whatever it is that you want to do, it's not a cop out. It's a coping mechanism, and coping mechanisms are great. They work, right? If we know that we're using them as coping mechanisms, right, which they don't necessarily help us deal with issues, but they help us deal with triggers and with being in a situation that is potentially unsafe, right? They're great skills to have, and they're great tools to have. So all of these things, I feel like they, you know, it's just interesting to me to remember that I don't think that we should be vulnerable all the time, right? And I don't think that everybody is safe for me to be vulnerable with them.
Yeah.
I might be a little bit more, you know, like your partner lady.
Yeah.
I might be a little bit more like, well, no, thank you,
God.
right? And other people, right? We all have our different.
Lila was asking him like direct questions, and he just, nope, that's not where he wanted to go. He wasn't gonna do it.
I think me and him would get along famously and just have no problem.
You really would. So if you need your armors, if they are still functioning as proper tools for you, as proper coping mechanisms, and they are helping you, then you keep them. This is something that I talked a lot about in my codependence support group, right? Is like, you can only put down your armors when it's safe to do so, you know? Welcome, Eric.
Yeah. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
And also making sure that people have the tools to handle it, because the hangover can go longer if you just did it in front of someone who can't hold space. There was no container. Exactly. So now they just re-traumatized you. Yeah.
Yeah. There are people that are not safe to be vulnerable with.
Yeah.
You know, and we don't often think about that. But like holding space is It's hard.
There are plenty of people who it's not supposed to be vulnerable with. There's so many of them, in fact. And so many places in which it doesn't, in which it's unlikely to be a positive outcome for us, right? So many spaces in which that doesn't feel safe.
It's like owning your vulnerability. Like you can't just drop it on anyone. Is this a smoke-free space?
So I had some possibilities, and go ahead, lady. Possibilities and thoughts that if we have the privilege and we have the desire to learn or strengthen the skill of vulnerability, that it is like a muscle. And when we strengthen a muscle, as we know, it tears a little bit. We stress it, it tears a little bit, and then we rest, and it heals. And what that looks like is us getting stronger at a thing, or us becoming more skillful with healing. I was thinking also about it as a big exhale. And then, you know, we're on the exhale sharing something of ourselves or our art that we hope is of value. And then there's this like liminal space before we see the response that has out in the world. Becca says, OMG, retweet the importance of the container. People who demand your vulnerability without holding a safe container for you can be really tricky to interact with.
Ooh, can they ever?
Yeah.
But some people have never been taught even how to hold a container. So also we have to give the opportunity to people to learn, okay, we need a container. Like, it's not always like ill-intentioned. I think a lot of people don't have the tools. They don't know what to do with your vulnerability sometimes.
That's true. That's very true.
Yeah, and maybe sometimes we can figure out how to, if the person is worth doing this for, educate them on how to hold space for us. Yeah. Like, here's what you can do in this moment for me, or could you sit here in silence and look at me while I share without responding, or whatever that might be.
Yeah. You had a beautiful list in your first video, I think, of how to deal with you when you're, so even giving someone a list and saying, hey, this is the way I want to be held when I'm being vulnerable, and negotiating.
Yeah, how to love me when I'm being vulnerable would be a good list to write. Margaritas might have leave me the fuck alone on it.
No, I think that's a really good idea. I would be like, just like turn around, close your eyes, pretend you're not there, and imagine you're a cat, and everything will be just fine. Okay.
Oh my God.
I should just do that.
Yeah.
I mean,
when we were doing this, the judges can get so loud, right? My inner judges get so loud. And one of the things I've been thinking about as I'm reading Playing Big is this inner critic, and how we might respond lovingly to that inner critic, because what that inner judge wants for us is usually for us to be safe and not to be rejected. And so if we are willing to undertake this and it feels okay, we can talk back to that inner judge and say, hey, I really hear that you're trying to keep me safe, and I appreciate that. Thank you for looking out for me. I got this. It's one way, it's one possibility. We can notice that in doing something edgy and risky for us, we somehow did not disintegrate. We're still here. And so is the rest of the world. So we might have a tendency to catastrophize about what will happen if we are vulnerable, simply reminding ourselves of the fact that our physical body is still here. The physical body is solid, and the world did not shatter might be helpful, perhaps. And after a certain interval, we could consider maybe doing something like that again. And that interval can expand or contract it based on the amount of time that we need it, right? And then you said this earlier, but I really have been thinking about it as an alcohol hangover. So what do you do for an alcohol hangover? You drink water, you rest, you might put some cold compresses on your forehead, you put yourself in a dimly lit room, or you have total darkness so that it doesn't hurt, the light doesn't hurt your eyes or your head. You drink more water. Hey, Paul. I can hear myself echoing. Can you mute?
Might be my microphone.
And you might take an anti-inflammatory. Can I mute you? I don't know how to do that. Okay. Oh my gosh. I just went to Pinterest. What is happening?
Hey, we're running the show. Lila's gone.
We put it right off the show. Okay, I'm leaving. Paul, I just wanted you to ask your question.
Right,
if you
okay.
want.
Oh, she's gone.
Myself echoing. Okay, so the last thing I wrote on that list was you might take an anti-inflammatory. You need something to help you calm the redness down. And you acknowledge that you just had a big expansion. You might need some contraction. You spoke to that earlier. You just got big. You might need to get small. That's why I curl up in the fetal position on my right side. That feels safe to me. And I did that at the end of the ceremony. It feels rejuvenating. It feels like taking an anti-inflammatory. It feels like calming my system down. And the last thing that I wrote here was Ari, who was just a guest on the podcast I just recorded with her, said we all want to feel seen, heard, and loved. So if you've had a big exposure, you might need to be with someone who will see, hear, and love you very easily. And that might be you, yourself, alone. That might be a family member, but you might just need to be with somebody easy to either sit with them in silence or to download with them. Well, did you have something you wanted to say? Did you have something you wanted to say?
Source of the audio problem here? Can you guys?
But now it's fine. We're good. Yeah, now we're good.
Yeah, because I'm hearing like a stuttering acting up.
No, you're fine.
Oh, okay. All right. Well,
Eric is. It was not you, Eric.
Oh, it's going on?
We have about 7 more minutes.
God. Maybe it's their server or something.
Vulnerable.
We're scrambling.
Both of us having a hangover right now.
So I was asking, does being put on the spot by somebody qualify as, inducing a vulnerability hangover? If somebody puts you on the spot, does that qualify?
Sure.
Yeah. I think it's probably varied what'll trigger the hangover. Definitely being unexpected means you can't prepare for it.
And it wasn't your choice, so it might be even more likely to produce one.
Yeah.
If you choose to step in that space also. Because then you feel forced, like vulnerability rape.
Oh, goodness. Yes.
I had a situation last night that made me think of this. It was a studio. They had like a master class dancing with this gal, and I mean, it was just, I don't know, we didn't mesh very well. She a compliment. She was just like, I really enjoyed dancing with you, and I was just like, I enjoyed dancing with you too. But it was, I'm trying to remember what she said. She was kind of fishing for a compliment because I didn't feel the same way, and I kind of went home afterwards feeling, I don't know, just feeling just very awkward and it made me uncomfortable. And
Yeah. Has it passed, or do you still feel
it
it?
had, yeah. I listened to some music and I relaxed and I did a little bit of self-care. Yeah, it was like it I don't know, it was very uncomfortable. And it seems like a lot of times,
So
like you, huh?
So you nursed your vulnerability hangover is what it sounds like.
Yes.
I've witnessed before where vulnerabilities clash, where you get two people who are both being vulnerable, but their needs are different. Their needs don't intersect necessarily in the way that they should, and it can lead to, like, I think, burnout. It could definitely escalate to burnout.
Tell me more. Like what is the misalignment?
It has to do, I think, with expectations, and it has to do with that, like, what each people are looking. Like, I was in a friendship where I last felt this, but it was an uneven friendship. There weren't proper boundaries to it. We both had different expectations as to where the friendship would go, and therefore, I was not able to, when my friend was being vulnerable with me, to give her what she really wanted, um, because that would put me out too much and would cross a boundary that I had established. Um, but I'm vulnerable in that relationship as well, because I was also relying on her for stability, for emotional help, and in a friendship. And it just the vulnerabilities just weren't aligning. I suck at explaining it, but they weren't aligning. So I had trouble, but until very recently, I wasn't very connected with even the idea of vulnerability and myself, or flexing the muscle of vulnerability. I was so out of touch with even picking up on when I was being vulnerable or who I was being vulnerable with, that I was not vulnerable enough. And it wasn't until I got a therapist and I started talking about some of my issues and things had built up to, like, basically a head of I wasn't being vulnerable enough, and certainly not with the right type of people. And it was becoming a huge problem for me. I had kind of like the opposite of a hangover, where it was just like, wow, I need to be more vulnerable. I need to be more clear. I need to be more in touch with what my needs are in order to, and I think what you were saying a while ago about vulnerability being a privilege, I think in order to be vulnerable, to be in touch with what your needs are, is like a requisite. Like, because I can't ask somebody else to give me what I need,
If you
and
don't know.
even if I don't know. That's kind of what I'm thinking. Does any of that make any sense?
Preach!
You just had a vulnerability hangover right there.
Did I?
You did.
Is there a buzzer? Is there a light that goes off? Do balloons, confetti fall from the sky?
You absolutely made. You know that you did, and you spoke powerfully from your heart. And then you were like, maybe that didn't make any sense. That totally made sense. So thank you for illustrating that so beautifully.
Oh,
I love you so much. Becca's like, you made so much sense, Eric. So it's 1 minute, and I wanted to say thank you for joining. It'll be this same time, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time next week, different topic. I hope you will join again. And may you use the armors that you need until they are no longer necessary. And at the times and in the moments in which it feels safe to do so, may you practice vulnerability and nurse your own hangover.
Yay. Thank you, Lila.
Thank you. We'll stop the podcast, but we can keep talking. Signing off.